For this lesson, we're going to set up the structure of our application using the factory pattern. Factory pattern is a method of organizing a Flask project in a way that allows you to create more than one instance of the application. This is beneficial for unit testing and provides you with the ability to run more than one version of the app at the same time. Although our project won't benefit directly from using the factory pattern, it's a good idea to get familiar with it because it's a common pattern in the industry. So if you haven't already, you can navigate to our project directory, Reminders, and you can activate your virtual environment. And then next we're going to do a little bit of cleanup here. We have some old files. We'll get rid of our old app file. We're not going to need that anymore, so move that to the trash. And then next we're going to create some files for our project and some folders for our project. So within the Reminders directory, first we want to create a file, and we'll call it run.py. Run.py is going to be sort of analogous to app.py. It's where we're going to point our, it's where we're going to point Flask to when we go to run our application. So next we want to create a directory. We're going to call it app. So the app directory is where we're going to house all of our application functionality and all of our factory logic for creating application instances. So we're going to open that up, and inside that we're going to create some more files and some more folders. So let's create the init file. We'll call it init.py. So you should be familiar with init files, but if you're not, just briefly, once you've created an init file, it signals to Python that the folder that you're in should be considered a Python module. For us, the init file on top of the module logic is also going to be where we house our factory logic, but we'll get to that shortly. Just going to close these up as we go. So next we're going to create two more files. We're going to make one called extensions.py. Oops. Extensions, there we go. Extensions.py. And one more, we're going to call it settings.py. And then we need to create two more folders. We need to create templates. And we also need to create static. And then inside the static directory, we're going to create two more folders, one for CSS and one for styles, or sorry, one for JavaScript. There we go. So the extensions file is where we're going to house all of our Flask extensions, and the settings file is where we're going to house all of our Flask settings. And then the templates directory is obviously where we're going to house our templates, our HTML Jinja templates. And the static folder is where we're going to keep our static assets like images, CSS, and JS. So next we're going to open up our init file, and we're going to import our Flask class. So we're going to go from Flask, import Flask. Then we're going to go down 2 lines. And we're going to define our factory function. So we'll call that create app. It'll take one parameter called config. And then within this function, we're going to create an application object, just like we did in our old app.py file. So we're going to go app is equal to Flask class with the special variable name. So one additional thing that we're going to add now is a configuration for the application. So we're going to go app.config from object, and we're going to feed it the config parameter. Now, what this is saying is, it's pretty self-explanatory, but basically it means configure the app from object, which means that it expects a Python object for the configuration. So we know that when we go to create an app using this function, we need to feed it a Python object to configure that app. And then finally, we want to return the app object so that when we create it, we can do something with it. So next I'm going to go down 2 lines, and I'm going to I'm going to stub out some functions. What I mean by that is I'm going to create the function definitions in anticipation that we're going to use them later, but we don't really have any logic for that right now. So we're just going to make them, and then we'll make them return nothing. So we'll go define register blueprints, and that'll take an app object for its configuration, or sorry, for its parameters, and we're just going to return. Down 2 lines, same thing, we're going to do register extensions. We'll use the 1 parameter and then return. And then down 2 more lines, and we'll go register shell. And we'll return nothing. Okay, so there we go. Again, these are just stubbed out functions. They don't do anything yet. Eventually we're going to call them within our create app function. In fact, let's just do that right now. Since the functions are stubbed out, it doesn't matter. We can run them anyway. So what we'll do is we'll go register blueprints. Oops, still getting used to Atom. Prints. And we pass the app object. So then we go register extensions app, and then we go register shell app. There we go. Okay, so this is the basics of our factory for our Flask application. This function takes a configuration parameter, creates an application object, configures that object using the config object, registers blueprints to the app, registers any extensions to the app, and then registers a shell to the app. And then it returns the application object, which is very, very important. Now, before we finish with our app factory, let's add a hello world view to our application just so that we can test it. Once we're finished, we can test that it's working the way we would like it to. So we'll go back into our create app function. We'll go at app root, just like before, and we'll use the base domain, and we'll go define hello, no parameters, and then we'll return hello world. Okay, there we go. So now we're done with our application factory logic. So we'll close up the init file, and then we'll move on. 1 second. There we go. You got to have good formatting. So we'll go ahead and close our init file, and then we're going to open up our settings file. So settings.py. Now we're going to do an import. We're going to import OS, which is our operating system package. We're going to go down 2 lines, and we're going to define a configuration class, or a base class actually. So we'll go class config. So now you should be familiar with classes and objects and just object-oriented programming in general, so I'm not going to touch too much on that right now. If you haven't spent too much time doing that and you need a refresher, I would pause now and just do a little bit of reading to get back up to speed. So this is going to be our base configuration class. Within this base configuration class, we're going to define some settings for Flask. For the time being, we're just going to define 1 setting, and then we're going to create 2 more instances that are going to inherit from this class that we're going to use for different environments. So the 1 setting that we're going to set is called secret key, and we're going to make this equal to an environment variable. So the way you do that is you use the OS package. So you go OS environ, oops, there we go, get, and then we want to get the environment variable app, or rather we'll go reminders secret. There we go. Like I said, we're only going to define the 1 for now, but we'll have more settings in the future that we'll need to add. So I'm going to go down 2 lines. I'm going to define another class, actually 2 more classes, but we'll start with 1. We'll go class prod config, and prod config is going to inherit from config. But we're going to add 2 more settings within the prod configuration. We're going to set an environment variable. set that to, or rather not an environment variable, but a variable called env, and we'll call that prod. And then we need to set the debug variable, and we'll set that to false. Within prod configurations, we don't want any type of debug information being added to the logs. So we're going to go down 2 lines, and then we're going to create one more class called devconfig, which is also going to inherit from config. And then we'll set env equal to dev, and we'll put debug equal to true, so that when we're working on our development version of the application, we'll have proper debug information. Okay, so that's it for our settings objects. So just to kind of recap, we've got 3 classes. We have a base configuration class called config, which has the secret key. Secret key is a setting within Flask. I believe Flask uses it to generate encryption for things like sessions. And then we have prod config, which is going to be our production configuration, which sets the environment to prod so that we can recognize the type of environment we're in within our application, and then sets debug to false. And then our dev configuration, which sets the environment to dev and debug to true. So we'll save settings.py, and then we'll exit out of that one, and we'll open up our run.py file. So now we're going to need to do some imports. So we need to import OS, and from app we need to import create app, which is our factory function, and then we want to do from app settings, which is settings.py. We want to import dev config and prod config. Okay, there we go. So what we're doing here is the result of having an init file. From app, we're referring to the application folder, and the reason that we can do that is because we created an init file, and it's considered a Python module. So we're saying from app init file, import the create app function, and then we say from the app settings file, import our dev and our prod configuration. So then we'll go down 2 lines, and we're going to create an app variable, and we're going to make that equal to the create function, which we're going to call. And as you probably remember, there we go, create app. Like you probably remember, our create app definition requires one parameter, which is a config, and the config has to be a Python object. And now you also probably remember, we just created 2 configurations, dev and prod, and both of them are Python objects. And if you remember from your Python tutorials or courses you've taken, everything in Python is an object. So if you pass along a class, that's considered an object. Okay, so what we need to do now is decide which configuration we're going to pass. And to do that, we're going to use environment variables again, and we're going to use kind of an inline if statement, which is just like a clever way of deciding which one of these configurations we're going to use. So we'll go prod config if os environ get Flask environment is equal to prod, else use the dev config. So it's kind of it's a little bit long-winded, but essentially it's saying use the prod configuration if this environment variable is equal to prod. Otherwise, use the dev configuration. So that's a pretty safe way of defining a production configuration, because this has to be explicitly set to prod before it'll use the production configuration. That way we don't accidentally use the wrong configuration. So that's it for creating the application, and that's it for our run file. So we'll close this. Next, we'll switch over to our shell, and we'll create our environment variables for our application settings. So if you're not familiar with environment variables, They're essentially variables that work at the system level that you can use to affect the way that running processes will behave. So let's start with an example. We'll just create an environment variable in our dev box. So we'll go export, export test var, and we'll make it equal to test. So it looks like it's set. To test it that it was set, we can go echo $, test. There we go. And there you go, it outputs test. So then you could use that environment variable to change the way that your application functions. Now the issue with this is this environment variable is specific to this shell context. So if I switch to a different tab and I go, let's clear that out, and I go echo test var, I get nothing because the environment variable was set within this context and not this one. So essentially the environment variables that we're setting, at least in this fashion, are ephemeral and won't last between shells. So we're going to need to come up with a way to work around that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add our environment variable declaration to our activate function, or sorry, our activate script in our virtual environment. And we're going to use a Linux command to add it. This is because the virtual environment was created outside of our shared source directory. So I kind of want to avoid using Linux text editors because that's its whole other series. So let's get started here. We're going to create the Flask _env environment variable, which is the one that we're using in our run.py file to determine which settings configuration to use. So we'll use the command echo export flask _env, and we'll set that to dev because this is a development environment. Close up those quotes, and you'll see that dev is surrounded by single quotes. And then we're going to do a double arrow, which is basically appending to our environment reminders bin activate. Okay, so now if we go echo, oh, actually no, first we need to activate. So we need to activate our reminders bin. There we go. So now that we've activated it, it should, in theory, have exported that Flask env variable. So if we go echo Flask env, there we go. So you can see that it added it. And I'll just open up the reminders bin activate, just so you can see. You can see it at the bottom right here. So it just added that command export that we had used previously to the activate script. So now we want to do the same thing with the rest of our environment variables so that each time we activate our virtual environment, it also exports these environment variables. So the next one is we need to create our secret key. So this one is a little bit trickier. To create the key, we're going to use Python. So we'll go Python. Just one second. Okay, and then we need to import some packages. We'll go import OS, and then we'll go import bin ASCII. Okay, and then we're going to use these packages to generate our string. So we'll go bin ASCII, hexlify. Oops, there we go. And then we go to generate a random. There we go. 24 characters long. Where we go here? Random. I got an extra N there. There we go. There it is. Okay. So now we've got our random string. I'm not going to talk too much about these functions. There's no point really in going into them. If you'd like to look them up, that's fine. But essentially we use them to generate this random string of numbers and letters. So I'm going to copy that to my clipboard, and then I'm going to Control D out of the Python shell. Next, we'll need to add that to our activate file. So we'll use the same command as before. We'll go echo export reminders secret is equal to single quote, and then I'll paste in that random string that we created, close up all the quotes, and then we want to add it to the environment reminders bin activate file. There we go. Again, let's just activate it. Oops. And then we'll echo out the environment variable. There we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so that looks good. And then we have one more to go, which is the Flask _ app environment variable. This is the one that tells Flask where the application should be bootstrapped from, or essentially where it should look for the application. So in the previous video it was app.py. In this video it's run.py. So we'll go echo export Flask app is equal to app.py. Oh, sorry, run.py. There we go. Close up all the quotes, and we want to add it to the environment bin activate. Okay, so let's test this and see if everything is working. So we'll reactivate our environment, and we want to echo Flask app. Okay, looks like it was added. Okay, perfect. So now we want to check and see if all these variables are coming together with the application logic that we added, and see if anything breaks. So we won't need to define the Flask _env variable like we did before, but we do need to run the application itself. So we'll go Flask run, and then the host, which is still 0.0. Okay, so it looks like it recognized our application. So we'll just switch over to our browser here, and then we want to put in our virtual machine's IP address. Mine is 192.168.2.25, port 5000, and we'll hit enter. And you can see hello world, which is the view that we registered within our create app function, which is great. That means everything that we've done so far is working. So there you have it. We have our basic Flask application structure. We've created it using the factory pattern, which is a great extensible way of using Flask. And I think that once you start working with Flask a little bit more and you start seeing it in the wild, you'll definitely have an appreciation of being able to recognize it and being familiar with it.